Imagine directing a film that, becomes an absolute cultural touchstone. Like, you tour the world, you collect all these accolades, and the film is just cemented into the history books.
Right, a total classic.
Exactly. Now, imagine spending your Lifetime Achievement Award tour decades later, being forced to completely erase that exact same film from existence, to literally, pull the plug on your own legacy.
It's pretty wild to even think about.
It really is. And that is the reality we are looking at today. It's a story about what happens when a masterpiece is suddenly and successfully reclaimed by the person who was harmed in its creation.
Yeah, and it completely upends how we think about the permanence of media, across the board.
Oh, for sure.
We tend to assume that once a film, or really any piece of art, enters commercial circulation and becomes part of the public consciousness, well, it belongs to the audience forever.
Right, like it's public property at that point.
Exactly. We rarely, if ever, consider the mechanics, or honestly the ethics, of a total recall.
Which is why I'm so excited for today's deep dive. Welcome in, everyone. We are jumping into a truly incredible article today that details this monumental and unprecedented shift in cinematic history.
A really massive shift.
Yeah. We are looking at the legendary German actress Nastassja Kinski and her grueling, decades-long, but ultimately victorious fight to have her 1975 debut film, which is called Wrong Move, completely removed from public access.
And our mission for this deep dive today is to really explore that incredibly intricate tension between a director's artistic legacy, the fundamental protection of minors on set, and how our modern understanding of trauma is forcing this retroactive rewriting of film history.
It's a lot to untangle.
It is, because this isn't just a dispute over a single movie. It is a fundamental challenge to the entire ecosystem of how art is made, how it's licensed, and how it's consumed by you and me.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when I was reading through the source material, the analogy that kept coming to my mind was like a world-famous museum being forced to return a prized artifact.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Because it's one thing to put a little placard next to a painting explaining its controversial history.
Yeah.
But it is a completely different universe to have the curators take the painting off the wall, pack it in a crate, and lock it in a vault forever, just because the muse demanded it.
It really forces us to ask, well, who actually owns the art?
Exactly.
It is a massive question. And to really grasp the magnitude of this recent decision, we first have to travel back in time to understand the origin of the grievance.
We have to look at the set.
We do. We need to examine the specific circumstances of that 1975 film set that sparked a 50-year battle. Because, we can't understand the erasure without understanding the creation.
So let's set the baseline using the facts from our source. The year is 1975. The film is Wrong Move, which is a road movie directed by Wim Wenders.
Right.
Now, Wenders eventually becomes this absolute titan of cinema, but this is earlier in his career. And Nastassja Kinski is making her acting debut in this film. She is just 13 years old.
Just 13.
Yeah. She plays a character who is a mute teenage acrobat, acting alongside these established adult co-stars like Rüdiger Vogler and Hanna Schigula. But the source really zeroes in on one specific scene that has come to define and ultimately destroy the film's legacy.
And we have to look closely at the mechanics of this scene because it is the epicenter of the harm we're talking about today.
Okay.
According to the source, the scene involves Kinski, at 13 years old, filmed topless, lying in a bed. An adult man, her 30-year-old co-star, undresses, gets into the bed with her, and lies on top of her.
Just processing those facts, it's staggering. A 13-year-old child and a 30-year-old man.
It is. And what's fascinating here from a structural standpoint is the absolute imbalance of power and how that power is systematically normalized under the guise of the filmmaking process.
Like it's just part of the job.
Yeah, exactly. Let's break down the hierarchy of a film set, specifically a European art house set in the 1970s. You have a 13-year-old girl making her debut. She has no industry capital, no experience, no union representative stepping in, and zero leverage.
She is literally the lowest rung on the ladder.
Precisely. And on the other side, you have a 30-year-old adult male co-star. And above them both, overseeing this entire interaction, conducting it, lighting it, blocking the physical movements, and approving the final take, is an adult male director.
Wow.
In that environment, the concept of a 13-year-old providing actual informed consent is just a total impossibility.
Right, because it's not just an isolated interaction between two people in a vacuum. There's an entire crew present.
A huge crew.
Yeah, there are dozens of adults standing around holding boom mics, adjusting the camera focus, checking the lighting. It's a collective of adults essentially agreeing that this is an acceptable professional thing to capture on film.
That is exactly what we call systemic compliance.
Right.
On a film set, the director's creative vision is the law. The crew's job is to execute that vision, not to, audit its morality. So for a 13-year-old dropped into the center of that machinery, the implicit message is overwhelming.
It's like, look around, everyone else is fine with this.
Exactly. The message is all of these adults are perfectly fine with this, therefore this must be what making a movie requires. This must be normal.
But she didn't internalize it as normal, which brings me to a quote from the source that I really want to dig into.
Yeah.
Looking back on the scene, Kinski says, quote, "That was my first film. He was my first director, and he didn't protect me."
Yeah.
And then she adds, "Even though I didn't know much age 13, I knew that that was not okay." And I want to push back on this a little bit, or at least explore the mechanics of it.
Sure.
Because she admits she didn't know much age 13, which makes total sense. If a child doesn't have the vocabulary for concepts like exploitation or power dynamics, how do they possess the instinctual knowledge that the situation is not okay, especially when every adult in the room is framing it as high art?
It's a paradox, right?
Yeah. How does that alarm bell ring when the environment is actively trying to muffle it?
That is an excellent question, and it cuts right to the heart of how trauma operates in the body, specifically through something called somatic memory.
Okay, what is that?
Well, children possess an incredibly highly tuned, innate sense of boundary violation. As you said, they might not have the sophisticated vocabulary to debate labor laws or ethical frameworks, but their nervous system recognizes a threat.
Wow.
It recognizes when an interaction is predatory or fundamentally unsafe.
So the body knows before the brain can even explain it.
Precisely. But the tragedy of this specific type of trauma, which is often referred to in psychological frameworks as institutional betrayal, is that the environment actively gaslights that physical instinct.
Oh, man.
Yeah. The child feels a profound sense of wrongness, but the adults they're supposed to trust, the authority figures directing the scenario, are validating it as work or as art. That creates a severe psychological fracture. The child is essentially forced to suppress their own survival intuition in order to comply and just, survive the immediate situation.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
And honestly, it maps onto much more mundane experiences too. I want you, the listener, to think about your own life, maybe your very first job.
That's a great comparison.
You're a teenager, you're totally out of your depth, maybe working your first shift at a restaurant or an office. If a manager tells you to do something that feels slightly off, the friction required to look an adult in the eye and say no is incredibly high.
It's so high.
Now multiply that by 1,000. You're a child, the boss is a famous film director, and the task involves your physical autonomy. The barrier to speaking up isn't just high, it's non-existent. You are trapped.
And this is a crucial point. The inability to speak up in that specific moment on set does not mean the harm wasn't registered. It simply means the reaction was delayed. That somatic discomfort, that internal voice telling a 13-year-old Kinski this is not okay, didn't evaporate when the director called cut. It incubated.
Which perfectly explains the timeline the source lays out, because this wasn't an immediate rebellion at all. The film came out in 1975. But Kinski didn't formally raise her concerns until 2011.
36 years later.
Exactly. That means for 36 years, this film just existed in the world, unbothered, celebrated, while she carried the invisible weight of it.
The incubation period of trauma is often deeply misunderstood by the public. People often ask, well, why wait decades to say something?
You hear that all the time.
But realizing you were wronged, processing the depth of that wrong, acquiring the societal vocabulary to articulate it, and finally building the emotional safety required to demand accountability from a powerful institution, that is a monumental leap that often takes a lifetime.
And even when she did take that leap in 2011, it wasn't an overnight success. The source notes that she spent the next 15 years, from 2011 up until just recently, trying to persuade Wim Wenders to withdraw the film from circulation.
15 years.
15 years of essentially saying, please take this down, you hurt me, and getting nowhere.
Sustaining a campaign for personal justice for a decade and a half is exhausting, especially when your opponent isn't just a person, but an entrenched cultural institution.
Because he's huge.
Right. Over those 36 years of silence and the subsequent 15 years of fighting, Wim Wenders had become a monument in the film world.
And that sets the stage perfectly for the major turning point that happened just last month at the German Film Awards. Wim Wenders is now 80 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, he's being celebrated for a massive post-war career. The source mentions iconic films like Wings of Desire and the recent hit Perfect Days.
He's a legend.
Totally. So he is at the award show to collect a Lifetime Achievement Award. And while he is literally holding an award for his life's work, he finally publicly addresses the controversies surrounding Wrong Move.
Finally.
But he doesn't do it to apologize.
No, he really doesn't. The source highlights that Wenders' initial comments at the awards were widely interpreted as a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
He framed Kinski's demands not as a legitimate grievance from a former child actor, but as a threat to, quote, cinematic freedom.
Unbelievable.
He argued that retrospectively editing or withdrawing a film shouldn't be a personal decision, but rather something that required a broad industry-wide discussion.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because I want to understand why he thought that defense would work.
Yeah.
Because to a modern ear, standing on stage and deflecting a child exploitation claim by talking about cinematic freedom sounds wildly out of touch.
Yeah.
Why was that his go-to move?
To understand why he used that shield and why the industry actually let him hide behind it for 15 years, we have to talk about something called auteur theory.
Okay, auteur theory.
This is the absolute bedrock of film criticism, especially in European cinema. Auteur theory argues that the director is the singular, brilliant author of the film.
Like they're writing a novel, but with cameras.
Exactly. Their vision is paramount, and the film is a sacred artifact of that vision. Under this theory, the art is totally isolated from the real-world conditions of its creation.
So the director is essentially a god, and the set is their universe.
That's a perfect way to put it. And because of auteur theory, the film industry has historically treated classic films as untouched, untouchable historical documents.
Right.
So when Wenders invokes cinematic freedom, he is tapping into a century of film theory. He is trying to elevate the conversation away from his specific actions toward a 13-year-old girl and turn it into a grand philosophical debate about censorship and the sanctity of the archive.
Wow.
He's essentially saying, if we pull my film, we threaten all of art.
It's the ultimate deflection tactic, and the part about needing an industry-wide discussion is so frustratingly familiar.
It really is.
It reminds me of how massive bureaucracies handle localized problems.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine a worker in a factory gets their hand crushed by a specific malfunctioning machine.
Okay.
They go to the CEO and say, "This machine is dangerous. You need to turn it off."
Mm-hmm.
And the CEO steps up to a podium and says, turning off machinery raises complex questions about global industrial output. What we really need is a multi-year international summit on the philosophy of workplace safety.
Wow, yeah.
And you just want to scream, no, stop talking about philosophy and just turn off the broken machine.
That is a brilliant analogy. It exposes the exact mechanism of bureaucratic delay. Powerful institutions love to use the promise of global summits or industry panels to diffuse blame.
Okay.
If a problem belongs to the whole industry, then nobody has to take immediate personal accountability for it. It traps the victim's tangible need for justice in a philosophical waiting room.
But I do have to ask, playing devil's advocate for a second, is the cinematic freedom argument entirely without merit?
Well, it's complicated.
Right, because, if a piece of media is actively causing harm to the person forced to participate in it, does the public's right to view historical art ever supersede the individual's right to not be exploited?
Historically, the industry's answer has almost unanimously been yes. The art is more important.
Man.
The artifact was prioritized regardless of the human cost. But what makes this specific case study so revolutionary is that Wenders attempted to use this classic foolproof auteur defense. Well, actually, I shouldn't say foolproof because it completely shattered.
It really did.
The industry didn't buy it this time.
It totally backfired. The source explains that instead of nodding along to his philosophical debate, the industry delivered a swift, decisive backlash.
And the source of that backlash is what finally broke the 15-year deadlock.
Right. Enter Julius Feldmeier. The source introduces him as a filmmaker and an actor. You might know him from the show Babylon Berlin.
Oh, right.
So Feldmeier hears Wenders' comments at the award show, and he publishes an open letter in response. And the Quote the source pulls from this letter is just a masterclass in cutting through the noise.
What did he say?
He writes directly to Wenders, quote, "It's your responsibility alone to set things right."
Wow. Notice how surgical that language is?
Yeah.
Your responsibility alone.
Yeah.
Feldmeyer completely rejects the industry-wide discussion deflection. He takes this grand philosophical debate and violently shrinks it back down to a single point of accountability.
Pinning him down.
He absolutely refuses to let a powerful legacy director hide behind the collective.
And the result is whiplash-inducing. After 15 years of stonewalling Nastassja Kinski, the article states that Wenders reverses course entirely within a matter of days following Feldmeyer's letter.
Days?
Yeah, he does a complete 180. He publishes a statement on the Wim Wenders Foundation website and on his Instagram, officially announcing that the foundation is withdrawing Wrong Move from all current channels of distribution.
It is a stunning capitulation. And the apology he issues alongside the withdrawal is equally remarkable because it represents a total abandonment of his auteur defense.
Let me read the exact wording from the source because it's wild. Wenders writes, "As the only person responsible at the time for Wrong Move who is still here, I recognized that Nastassja Kinski should have been better protected back then." And then he gives the apology. "For that, I apologize to you, Nastassja, unreservedly, no ifs or buts."
No ifs or buts. That phrase is critical.
Because it's so rare.
Exactly. Public figures rarely apologize without qualifiers. They usually say, "I apologize if anyone was offended," or "I apologize that the standards of 1975 were different."
The classic non-apology.
Exactly. But Wenders strips all of that away. He accepts absolute ownership of the power dynamic. He admits he was the adult responsible and she was the child who was owed protection.
But I am so stuck on the timeline here. Nastassja Kinski, the actual victim who lived the trauma, pleaded with him for 15 years, and he held his ground. Julius Feldmeier, a younger male actor, writes one letter, and Wenders folds in 3 days. Why?
It reveals a very harsh reality about how power, validation, and legacy function in the entertainment industry. For a decade and a half, Wenders could internally categorize Kinski's campaign as an isolated dispute, or perhaps dismiss it through a patriarchal lens as an emotional grievance. He could compartmentalize it.
Sure.
But when a respected younger member of his own professional cohort publicly calls him out, the equation changes. Legacy creators are obsessed with their reputation.
I mean, that's what a Lifetime Achievement Award is all about.
Exactly. Feldmeier's letter was a signal from the younger generation saying, "We don't view your actions as cinematic freedom. We view them as a failure of leadership, and your legacy is rotting."
Wow.
That immediate threat of losing the respect of his peers is what shattered his stubbornness.
Okay, I want to pivot to the actual mechanics of the victory, because the source says that streaming, TV, and distribution partners have been officially instructed to remove Wrong Move. But let's be real about the digital age. I can probably go online right now and find a bootleg copy of this movie in 5 minutes. People have physical DVDs sitting on their shelves.
Sure.
So realistically, how does a foundation actually withdraw a film? Can a piece of media ever truly be erased, or is this just a symbolic gesture?
Well, it is much more than a symbolic gesture, but you are right that literal, total erasure is impossible in the digital age. Pragmatically, physical media exists.
Yeah.
Piracy networks will host the file forever. The Wim Wenders Foundation cannot send agents into people's living rooms to snap their DVDs in half.
So what exactly are they doing? What is the mechanism of a withdrawal?
The mechanism relies on distribution rights and licensing. The Wim Wenders Foundation owns the underlying rights to the film. When they announce withdrawal, they are legally instructing their distribution partners to terminate commercial availability.
Okay, so it's a legal process.
Exactly. They issue takedown notices to streaming platforms like Criterion or MUBI. They refuse to renew television broadcast licenses. They stop printing new physical copies.
So it's about shutting off the official valves.
Exactly. And the true victory here isn't the deletion of every digital file on Earth. The victory is the removal of institutional sanction.
Oh, that's a great point.
When legitimate platforms remove the film, it loses its status as an officially endorsed piece of commerce. It forces anyone who wants to watch it to actively seek out a banned, illicit artifact in the dark corners of the internet, rather than casually stumbling upon it on a mainstream streaming menu.
That makes a huge difference.
It does. The victory is the director himself permanently altering the context of the film, downgrading it from a celebrated classic to an acknowledged mistake.
That is a profound distinction. It strips the film of its legitimacy. And to truly understand why this shift in context is sending shockwaves through the industry, we have to look at the academic framework surrounding this.
We do.
We need to look at how we, as a culture, are fundamentally changing the way we consume cinema.
Because this single case study is acting as a battering ram against those decades of entrenched auteur theory we discussed earlier.
The source brings in Professor Tanya Horek to explain this. She is a professor of film and feminist media studies at Anglia Ruskin University, and she spoke to The Mirror about the implications of Kinski's victory.
Her analysis provides the exact vocabulary we need to understand this cultural shift.
Let's unpack her core assertions, because she's dismantling the old hierarchy piece by piece. First, she attacks the art versus human life debate directly.
Okay.
She says, and this is a quote from the source, "The film as a piece of art is not more important than the fact that a child was harmed. A film director's ego does not matter more than that."
Yeah.
It sounds so universally true when you say it out loud, but as we've established, the industry has historically operated on the exact opposite logic.
For over a century, the implicit understanding in Hollywood and European cinema was that a masterpiece justified collateral damage.
Justified it.
Yeah. If a tyrannical director abused his cast, but the resulting film won at Cannes, the abuse was romanticized as the cost of genius. Professor Horek is establishing a hard, unyielding ethical boundary. Human welfare must always supersede artistic output.
She also touches on the timeline aspect, pushing back against the idea that old claims should be ignored. She says, "There is not a time limit on these cases. Trauma is a very complicated thing."
Which perfectly aligns with our discussion on somatic memory and incubation. She is challenging the public's desire for a neat, legalistic statute of limitations on human pain.
Right, because pain doesn't work like a contract.
Exactly. Trauma doesn't care what year a movie was released. It can lay dormant and be violently triggered by new events, like seeing the man who exploited you handed a Lifetime Achievement Award on national television.
Ugh.
Dismissing Kinski's claim simply because the film is 50 years old is a fundamental misreading of psychology.
But the quote from Professor Horek that really fundamentally changes the game is this one. She says, "You can't separate what happens on set from the final product."
That single sentence is the death knell for traditional auteur theory.
Explain why. Because as an average moviegoer, I've always been taught to judge a film by what is inside the four corners of the screen.
Right.
Is the acting good? Is the cinematography beautiful? Is the script sharp?
And that is exactly what auteur theory trained you to do, to separate the genius of the product from the misery of its creation. But Professor Horek is arguing that this isolation is a total myth.
Okay.
She is asserting that the method of creation is inextricably baked into the artifact itself. If a scene required the exploitation and silencing of a 13-year-old girl to capture it on celluloid, then exploitation is the primary ingredient of that film's DNA.
It permanently alters the text.
Yes. You are no longer just watching a performance. You are watching a documentary of an abuse of power. Recognizing the harm on set must now dictate how the cinema is framed and viewed.
It makes me think about how consumers have adapted to this exact logic in almost every other industry.
How so?
Think about the global supply chain. If you buy a gorgeous, perfectly tailored shirt, and then you watch a documentary exposing that the specific factory that made your shirt uses abusive child labor, it completely destroys your relationship with the product.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't look at the shirt and say, well, the stitching is still genius, so we must separate the art of the shirt from the artist in the sweatshop.
Nobody says that.
No. You probably throw the shirt in the trash, or at the very least, you feel deeply uncomfortable wearing it. We intrinsically understand that a tainted supply chain ruins the final product. So why do we give movies a pass that we wouldn't give to a t-shirt?
Because cinema deals in illusion, empathy, and emotional manipulation. A film is meticulously designed to make you forget you are watching real people doing a job.
Right, you get lost in it.
The lighting, the music, the narrative, it's all a magic trick intended to make you empathize with the fictional character rather than the physical actor casting the shadow on the screen.
Yeah.
It is much harder to break the spell of a great movie than it is to look objectively at a t-shirt.
Which is an incredible challenge for you listening right now. Think about your absolute favorite classic movie. Maybe it's a grit and grime 70s thriller or a golden age Hollywood classic, a film you've watched a dozen times.
Yeah.
If you found out tomorrow that an actor was severely traumatized or a child was actively harmed just to capture that one iconic scene you love, could you still watch it? Could you still enjoy the art? It is a genuinely uncomfortable mirror to hold up to our own viewing habits.
It demands that we mature as an audience. We have to decide if we are willing to sacrifice our uncomplicated, nostalgic enjoyment of certain media if we learn the cost of that media was human suffering.
That's a heavy choice.
It is. However, as clear-cut as this academic theory is, when we look back at Nastassja Kinski's actual life, we see that navigating trauma within an active career is incredibly messy and complex.
So what does this all mean for her trajectory? Because this is the part of the source material that might trip people up. You might assume that after a traumatic exploitative experience at age 13, Kinski would flee the industry, or at the absolute minimum, avoid Wim Wenders for the rest of her life.
Sure, that makes sense on paper.
But the source highlights a profound paradox. She didn't leave. She went on to star in over 60 films across Europe and the United States. She became a massive international star.
A huge star.
And crucially, the article points out that in 1984, almost a decade after Wrong Move, she collaborated with Wim Wenders again. She starred in his critically acclaimed Palme d'Or-winning film, Paris, Texas.
This raises an important question, and it is precisely the kind of detail that bad faith detractors love to weaponize.
Oh, I bet.
The cynical reaction is to point to Paris, Texas and say, see? If the first movie was so traumatizing, why did she willingly go back to work with him as an adult?
I'll admit, when I first read that detail, I had to stop and think about it. It seems counterintuitive to return to the source of your trauma. How do we reconcile a 13-year-old victim with a 23-year-old willing collaborator?
We reconcile it by understanding the pragmatic realities of the film industry and the incredibly nuanced psychology of reclaiming power. First, let's look at the pragmatism.
Okay.
In the late 70s and 80s, Wim Wenders was one of the most important, influential directors on the planet. If you were a European actress trying to solidify a serious international career, working with Wenders was the ultimate stamp of prestige.
It's a career maker.
Exactly. From a purely business standpoint, turning down the lead role in Paris, Texas would have been an act of professional self-sabotage.
Right. She has to navigate the board as it exists, not as she wishes it was.
Exactly. But the psychological element is even more fascinating. In trauma recovery, we often see a subconscious drive to return to the site or the dynamic of the original harm, but under new terms.
Wow.
When Kinski returns to Wenders' set in 1984, she isn't a voiceless 13-year-old debutante anymore. She is an adult, she is an established star, and she has leverage.
It's like a junior employee who was bullied by a terrible boss early in their career. Years later, they get promoted to a senior executive role, and they actively choose to take a meeting with that old boss. They aren't going back because they like the boss. They are going back to test their new armor. They are going back to prove to themselves that the power dynamic has fundamentally shifted and they are no longer vulnerable.
That is a perfect, grounded way to understand it. She was returning to the dynamic to reclaim her agency. And this is the most critical point to synthesize. Her adult choices do not retroactively erase her childhood trauma.
Right.
Returning to a previous director does not invalidate the harm originally caused. Both realities are true simultaneously.
Yeah.
She was exploited by Wenders at 13, and she brilliantly collaborated with him to make art at 23, demanding that victims behave with perfect, linear consistency throughout their entire lives is a deeply insidious form of victim blaming.
And what proves her consistency in seeking accountability is that Wenders isn't the only industry giant she has successfully taken on.
No, she has a history.
The source provides a vital piece of precedent. It notes that this recent victory with the Wim Wenders Foundation is not an isolated incident. Kinski previously fought against a television film directed by Wolfgang Petersen.
Another huge name.
Right. Now, Wolfgang Petersen directed Das Boot and The Never-Ending Story. According to the article, Kinski appeared naked in one of his films at the age of 15. And she successfully campaigned against that project too, eventually reaching a formal distribution agreement with the German broadcaster NDR to restrict its circulation.
Which is an astonishing track record of dismantling the archives of powerful men.
It really is. We have this woman who, as a teenager, was repeatedly thrust into compromising, exploitative positions by the most powerful directors in the European system.
Yeah.
She navigates the machine, builds a 60-film career, survives the industry, and then, decades later, uses her accrued power to systematically go back and force these institutions to pull the plug on the media that harmed her. Does this pattern of fighting both Petersen and Wenders establish her as a genuine pioneer in European film law?
Without a doubt, she is single-handedly creating legal and cultural precedent for the retroactive revocation of consent.
That's massive.
For Kinski's campaigns, the idea that an actor could legally force a broadcaster like NDR or a rights holder like the Wenders Foundation to suppress a commercially viable film based on a retroactive ethical claim was almost unheard of.
She's blazing a trail.
She is drafting the blueprint. She is proving to the industry that classic status does not grant a film permanent immunity from ethical review. She has transitioned from being a vulnerable object trapped inside the frame to an active editor of cinematic history.
It is an absolutely massive journey of resilience. We've traced a path from a silenced 13-year-old girl subjected to systemic compliance on a 1975 film set, incubating that trauma for 36 years, fighting for 15 more, to finally becoming a 65-year-old woman who marshaled the cultural zeitgeist to force a legendary director to erase his own work.
And as we summarize the ground we've covered today, it becomes clear that the story of Wrong Move has transcended the film itself. It is a definitive case study in the rapid shifting of power dynamics within legacy industries. We watch the old guard's ultimate defense, the auteur shield of cinematic freedom, crumble under the weight of a new cultural mandate, enforced not just by the victim, but by the younger generation of filmmakers who refuse to inherit a tainted system.
The mandate is now written in stone. A director's ego and a film's historical legacy can never eclipse the safety and dignity of a child. The art is simply not worth the harm.
As we wrap up, I encourage you to use this deep dive as a practical lens for your own life. Knowledge is most valuable when it is applied.
Absolutely.
The next time you engage with media, challenge the myth of the singular genius. Look past the frame and consider the invisible human cost, the labor, and the power dynamics behind the content you enjoy. When the audience demands ethical creation, the industry has no choice but to adapt.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over, directly inspired by our conversation about Professor Horrocks' theory. If we truly embrace the reality that we can no longer separate what happens on a film set from the final product, if the context permanently alters the text, how many other universally beloved masterpieces in our collective history would fundamentally change before our eyes? Or perhaps how many classic films would completely vanish from our screens forever if we fully understood the true conditions of their creation? It's something to think about the next time you sit down and press play. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and we'll catch you next time.